Direct rule, the we are in charge approach. Some colonial powers took a very involved approach known as direct rule. In this system, European officials were put in charge of everything, government, administration, you name it. Local institutions were often either replaced with European ones or made less important. The colonial power was the boss, calling all the shots and making all the decisions. This could be efficient, but it also meant that the local people had little to no say in how their own lives were run. Often, the goal of direct rule was to assimilate the colonized people into the colonizers' culture. This could mean making them learn the colonizers' language, go to their schools, and follow their laws. It was a way to make the colony more like the home country. But direct rule wasn't always easy. It often required a strong military presence to keep control, especially if there were local resistance movements pushing back against the colonizers. Case studies: French colonialism in Algeria. The French implemented a system of direct rule, appointing French officials to govern and seeking to assimilate the Algerian population into French culture. Belgian colonialism in Congo. King Leopold II of Belgium established a brutal regime of direct rule in the Congo Free State, characterized by forced labor and widespread human rights abuses. Indirect rule, the puppet master approach. Other colonial powers preferred a more subtle approach called indirect rule. Instead of sending in their own officials to run everything, they ruled through existing local leaders. These leaders might be traditional chiefs or rulers, or they could be new leaders appointed by the colonizers. This method relied on cooperation between the colonizers and local elites. The local leaders got to keep some power and authority, but they had to follow the rules set by the colonial power. Indirect rule often allowed for some degree of cultural preservation. Local customs and traditions could continue as long as they didn't get in the way of the colonizers' goals. This approach was also cheaper for the colonial powers because they didn't have to send as many of their own people to run the colony. Case studies: British colonialism in India. The British Raj used indirect rule, governing through local princes and rulers who were loyal to the British crown. Dutch colonialism in Indonesia. The Dutch East India Company established a system of indirect rule, working with local sultans and regents to maintain control. Settler colonialism. Now, settler colonialism was a completely different matter. It wasn't just about controlling a territory. It was about moving in and making it a new home. Large numbers of people from the colonizing power would migrate to the colony, often displacing or marginalizing the indigenous people who already lived there. Land grab. Settler colonialism often involved taking land from indigenous people, sometimes through force or unfair treaties. Building a new society. The settlers created their own communities, laws, and institutions, often mirroring those of their home country. They saw themselves as building a new society in the image of the old one. Long-term consequences. This type of colonialism has had a lasting impact on many places, shaping their demographics, cultures, and political systems for generations. Case studies: British colonialism in Australia. British settlers displaced and marginalized the Aboriginal population, establishing a new society based on British laws and customs. French colonialism in Algeria. French settlers established a large community in Algeria, leading to conflicts and tensions with the indigenous Algerian population. Company rule. Finally, there was a company rule, a type of colonialism where private companies, not governments, were given control over a territory. These companies were all about making money, and they often did it at the expense of the local people and the environment. Corporate power. These companies had a lot of power. They could make laws, raise armies, and even wage wars. Think of them like mini governments with their own agendas. Profit-driven. Their main goal was to maximize profits for their shareholders, not to look out for the well-being of the people living in the colony. Lack of accountability. There was often little oversight of these companies, which meant they could get away with all sorts of shady practices. Case studies: British East India Company and India. This company ruled over large parts of India for over a century, extracting resources and exploiting local labor for profit. Dutch East India company in Indonesia. This company also had a long history of exploitation and violence in its pursuit of profit. The legacy of colonial rule. The methods of colonial rule left deep scars on the colonized territories. They shaped political systems, economies, social structures, and cultural identities. The consequences of colonialism are still being felt today, with many former colonies struggling with poverty, inequality, and political instability. It's a complex and painful legacy that we continue to grapple with.